Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 15, Part 2, A Flash of Green by John D. MacDonald. And welcome back to Point Blank. Joining me as always, here's Justin.
Hey folks, and good afternoon, Mr. Kurt. Good to hear your voice again. How's the boat been?
Oh, it's been very wet.
Have you dodged those hurricanes?
We have dodged the hurricanes. By the time this airs, we should be well out of hurricane season.
Very good.
But with the weather as it is these days, one never knows.
One does not. Have you dodged all the tar-encrusted dolphins?
I have not seen a tar-encrusted dolphin recently.
Thank goodness.
And that does bring us into some of the issues that we're going to discuss today in A Flash of Green, because environmentalism on the Gulf of Mexico's shores is certainly a key element of MacDonald's fiction.
Absolutely.
One would think he'd be kind of upset about things in the Gulf with the BP spill, and then this more recent spill that they've been talking about that's been going on for 14 years.
Oh my God, I heard about that. This decade has been terrible for the Gulf. The BP oil spill in 2010-11. I thought that was the end of the world for the Gulf, and yet we hear about this other one that's been going on for even longer, and there's no real goal in mind for its endpoint. It's just going to keep going, and hopefully at the end of the century it might fizzle out.
Well, we'll get into that, and people like our fictional Save Our Bays Foundation are working on those issues in the Gulf of Mexico as we speak.
Exactly. And our podcast isn't about how to be depressed. It's about great works of noir and detective fiction.
No, but strife and depressed characters often come up in our fiction.
Yes.
But before we get into A Flash of Green, is there anything, Justin, that you're currently reading or watching you want to just throw in?
I've been in like this super slog phase. Like I'm reading a lot of very long books, tough reads, that kind of thing. I got through Don DeLillo's Underworld. I was listening to it as an audiobook, which is it's a heavy, complicated book with this broken, fragmented narrative, and it goes everywhere. And I enjoyed that, but I was reading that while I was reading our last book from episode 14, Nordic Noir, Stieg Larsson, and which is a long book. And on top of that, I was reading Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, which is one of those old classic Russian books that I never read. I had this one day where I just felt like, I got to start tackling these big, long books. So I started to do it all at once, which is just like a classic Justin move. And then I get overwhelmed and I'm like, why do I do this to myself? Torture, self-flagellation. I've gotten through all those books except for Karamazov. I'm at 96% on the Kindle. So I am so close to being done. I feel like that's one reason I'm really excited about getting into some like 200-page hard-boiled noir books. I want to read like 5 in a row just to like clear my mind. Play basic plot, no complications, no weird-ass unnecessary characters or conversations, which brings to mind A Flash of Green, but we'll get there in a moment. So that's one thing that I've been slogging through. We don't usually mark the seasons on this podcast, but let's just say it's fall time. So I've been trying to absorb as many scary shows and films as I can. And I actually saw the movie John Carpenter's The Thing, which came out in 1982 for the first time. And when it came out, it was considered... It just bombed. It was terrible. Critics hated it. Viewers hated it. But since it's become sort of this cult classic, a bunch of researchers in Antarctica are pretty much stranded. They're doing research, but this group of Norwegians that lived or occupied space close to them, they get wiped out. And one of them comes and sort of freaks out on their research base. And the question arises like, well, why? And of course, the why is the thing. And I won't explain it, but I thought it was going to be more of a scary thriller, and it was like gross out horror, like great special effects, like classic Fangoria special effects from the early 80s. And it was super fun. Like I just loved it. And it featured Kurt Russell of Captain Ron fame. And I really enjoyed it. And I was glad I was able to see this. I mean, it was much more subtle than a lot of the bad reviews framed it as. So I recommend it.
Have you seen recently all the Thing references in the news cycle because of there was just recently a stabbing at the Antarctic Research
Oh my!
Station?
No, I saw the giant rectangular block of ice, but I have not heard about the stabbing.
Yeah, there was a stabbing just recently at the research station, and a lot of people were like, "Oh my God, it's the Thing coming!"
Yeah.
If you actually read the story, they had an argument over like who was going to take the top bunk or not, and that led to a stabbing.
So it was some bad seed happened to be let in, so it wasn't rooted in some kind of ancient alien DNA or shapeshifters.
Perhaps, but if that's the case, it was brought from outside of the continent.
Understood. So the rest of the world is already infected, probably.
For sure.
How about you? I imagine that you are trying to soak in as much media as you can before heading back out.
Yeah, I have a couple of things I've been watching and reading lately, and well, in playing in this case. But first of all, I have finally started watching the 70s TV show, The Rockford Files.
Aha, yeah.
And that is something, I don't know if it wasn't in reruns where I grew up or what, but I mean, I knew it existed, but I don't think I've ever seen an episode of the show until just recently. And it's so quintessential to that PI fiction that I decided I got the whole thing on Blu-ray so I can watch it in order. There's also a podcast, and this is what made me think of it, is there's a couple of role-playing game designers who I'm sort of follow or whatnot, and they have a podcast called $200 a Day, and they go through each of the episodes, and it's a little bit like our show in that they talk about what works or what doesn't work in the narrative elements of each episode, and how the pacing is well written or not, and some of the tropes of the genre that you see. They kind of do that for the majority of the podcast, and then at the very end, they use it as a discussion point for either writing fiction or setting up gaming scenarios for tabletop role-playing. And you could skip that last part if you just wanted to hear the discussion of the show. But because of that podcast, I thought, well, I'm going to pick this up, I'm going to watch it, and I want to listen to the podcast after each episode and see how it goes. So I'm enjoying that so far.
That's fun to hear because I remember being a kid. I had a friend named Bobby, and I'd go over to his house, and he had his dad, who was like this tennis enthusiast, and he'd always sit downstairs and watch tennis on the TV, and I hate tennis, and so I just was like, oh, that's so boring. But he also loved the Rockford Files, and I'd hear about the Rockford Files, and I didn't know, so I always associate it with something super boring and old on CBS that I would never relate to. And then, of course, as I got into noir and crime fiction and whatnot, I realized that's a PI and that I should be drawn to it. And so I want to watch it, and I'm glad that you started because it would help break the curse that developed when I was like 10.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously some parts of it are dated, but many parts are actually not. And it's interesting. I mean, I don't want to give too much of it away or whatever, but I think it's I'm probably going to talk about it again because it's such a long-running program and is going to be a lot to watch and process. But I'm already really enjoying it, and I'm enjoying seeing the references to some of the classic bits of crime fiction that we've discussed come through when they're writing the TV script.
That's cool. Also, it's really cool that it turns out that Rockford is actually the alien in The Thing, and I liked how they tied that together.
Then another book, and I normally wouldn't mention this until I'd finished it, but I've been reading, and I'm about halfway through the book Total Chaos by Jean-Claude, I think it's Izzo, Izzo, or Izzo. And this is a book, the first book of the Marseille trilogy. It's really good. I really enjoy it. It's one of those book series where I'd seen so many people reference this trilogy that when I happened to see it on the shelf, I'm like, you know what? I got to pick this up and read it. And I'm really enjoying it. It talks about the life very, very well, captures Marseille, and it captures a lot of issues of conflict. And I'll give it a full review later on, but man, I think that's one that at some point we may have to cover in a full episode is maybe the trilogy in full. I don't know. It's not that long.
Damn, I'm just looking it up as you speak about it, and it looks super awesome.
Yeah, it's so far it is top notch Mediterranean noir, which is something we haven't really covered at all. But this is definitely noir. It's not like Scandinavian noir has just got that noir tacked on the thing. This has got a noir feel to it.
Cool. I'm trying not to pull the trigger and buying it right now. I'm trying to save it for the holidays.
There you go. And then speaking of the holidays, the other thing I just picked up, sort of as a, let's call it an early Christmas present to myself, is I picked up Red Dead Redemption 2.
Oh, you lucky dog.
Yes, and I mentioned that on this podcast. For those who aren't familiar, this is a Western video game, and the first one is probably one of my top 5 video games of all time. It has that, in Westerns, there's often a feel of the doomed figure or whatever, and there's a lot of crossover with those noir feelings. And these video games definitely capture that. There's this for those, I don't give anything away, but for those who may have played the first game, or even if you watch one of those YouTube videos about like the story arc of the first game, it's a tragic story. It's about bandits who are out in the West, and yes, they've made bad decisions, but sometimes they try to do good, and sometimes they fail at that, and sometimes they don't. But their story is very tragic, and that's tied in. And I think this is what the developers and writers already, I've seen this in the first part of Red Dead Redemption 2, is there's really this foreboding feeling of the lament about the loss of the West, the loss of the wilderness or the wildness of the West to civilization.
Sure.
You get that sense of an end of an era, an end of an age. And one of the things I will say, because it's written from a modern point of view, is it's not just like the loss of the cowboy way. It's definitely referencing the Native American experience and some of the freedoms that people who, particularly African Americans, didn't find in the rest of the United States. They found a freedom in the West that as civilization caught up with them, so did a lot of civilization's ills. So, and the game deals with that, and it is absolutely beautiful. The gameplay is pretty good. I'm only a couple hours in, but man, it's good.
As I mentioned to you before, I'm not a video game player generally, and I'm certainly not a video game finisher. But that's the only game in the, let's call it the modern era or the current century that I played from start to finish. The first Red Dead Redemption, and I love it because I'm a Western buff, but I love the tale. It's a Wild West tale which is rooted in Outlaw West, which is the arena for crime fiction, and it's a hard and gritty storyline, and things don't usually end well for most people. So, but it's also there's this beauty and there's this grace, and it's just a really well written video. So I really love how they've constructed the narrative for those stories. So I'm glad to hear that the second one is good. I'm disappointed that they don't let us play it if you only have a PS3. So, oh well. Maybe someday I'll come visit you in Seattle on a flimsy excuse just to play your game.
Yeah, you'll have to camp out on my couch for like a week just to
and suffer through cat allergies. I'll just be like all red in the face and wheezing, but it'll be worth it, I'm sure.
Yes. Well, we should move into our main topic for today, which is John D. MacDonald's A Flash of Green. Before we get into our discussion, do you want to give us a summary of the book, Justin?
Indeed. I'm too busy putting these Marseille trilogy books on my wish list for the holidays. So let me finish that. I got all 3 on there now. I'm pretty excited. Now that's number 1 on my list right now. I'd love to just get away and go drift off in the Mediterranean and watch people die. That sounds perfect. For the book of the month for us, we have A Flash of Green, John D. MacDonald. We introduced it briefly in the part 1 of this episode 15. But let me wax for a little bit on this summary. I'm going to give you my general thoughts and then sort of dive into some of the nitty gritty. John D. MacDonald, Flash of Green. We've said this more than once that we, let's just say we mucked it up a little bit. If we had to choose again, we probably would not have chosen this particular MacDonald book for a feature for several reasons. But we did, and our reasoning was valid at the time. It's just sometimes you read a book and you're surprised that what you thought was going to happen does not happen. So this book was written in 1962, or at least that's when it was published by Simon & Schuster. It precedes MacDonald's best-known creation. You might be familiar with Travis McGee and the many books that MacDonald produced using that main character as the center point. This book was, interestingly enough, credited as being one of the first, if not the first, crime fiction story that featured the environment as a major theme. The idea of the environment being something that's worth protecting, or that's something that people advocate for. Because in 1962, that was right at the beginning, the very beginning of the modern environmental movement. Rachel Carson put out Silent Spring right around that time. Just a few years later, as the student uprisings of the 60s really took hold, the modern environmental movement, Earth Day, all that kind of stuff really sort of exploded into the mainstream. So in a sense, this is a historical book, and that's one of the reasons we decided to feature it. That little wrinkle made it unique historically. Now, I do love that MacDonald had the cojones and the awareness to see the effect of development, real estate development, on fragile ecosystems. I just wish that he made a more exciting book on the topic. This book did not do what I expected it to do. Here's what it did. We have three main characters. We got Jimmy Wing. Let's call him the big main, the protagonist. He's a journalist in Palm City, which is a sleepy town on Florida's Gulf Coast. And it's a pseudonym for Sarasota, Florida, on the Gulf Coast, which is just south of Tampa. We have Elmo Bliss. He's a rich, powerful local real estate guy. He has political ambitions. He knows a lot of people. He's one of those sort of conniving, scheming, Machiavellian types. He's got money, but he's not, I would say he's an asshole. He's very selfish in his inclinations. However, he's also made complex and interesting because John D. MacDonald is an interesting writer. He cares about his characters. So I'll admit that Elmo is not just a cardboard cutout bad guy. The third character in question is Kat, or Catherine Hubble. She's Jimmy Wing. Let's call her a love interest, though that gets complicated. We'll talk about that later. But let's call her a local gal as well. She lives in town. She's been an environmentalist. She's fought to protect the local bay, which is called Grassy Bay in the story, from developers, from real estate, destroying what's there, and digging and dredging and building a complex on the coast. They won that battle, but now this novel features a new battle, a new uprising from the developers' side of things. They want to try to develop Grassy Bay for a second time. Anyway, Kat gets in the middle of all that. She's a widow. Her husband, who used to be an activist, he passed away recently. She's raising their two children, and she finds out from Jimmy that the bay is now in danger yet again. And this sort of catalyzes and sets the tone for the rest of the story, whether or not the bay will get developed. So we have this guy Elmo, and I like to call him Boss Hogg, even though he hasn't been characterized in any way as a Boss Hogg-like character. But Boss Hogg pays off Jimmy Wing to essentially play the development side in the local paper. He tells Jimmy to write articles that sort of make the development look good. And as a reader, I expected Jimmy Wing to be reluctant, anti-hero maybe, but favoring the environmental side of things. He doesn't do that at the beginning, which makes him hard to like as the story proceeds, but I'll get to that later. This decision that Boss Hogg essentially asks and Jimmy agrees to make goes against his inclinations, but his life is very complicated. His wife is in a mental asylum, and that weighs on him emotionally. He's depressed. He seems just sort of lethargic and lost in the world. So he tosses his moral scruples into the sought breeze, and we really have a plot here, or at least we think we do. Also, there's another thing, and I mentioned the love interest. He does have a crush on Kat Hubble. She doesn't seem to like him very much at first, and maybe not ever, but there is a thing between them, and especially from Jimmy's point of view, that helps to feed some of the narrative going forward. Here's some other things that I think about this story. And I'm just going to say some things, and it's going to be irregular. I don't usually do this for my reviews. Usually I try to just give a plot, and then we chat. But I didn't love this book, and I admit I didn't even like it, and that was a huge problem, given that I had to spend a podcast talking about it. So let me just say some things. Jimmy is super lame all the way through, before becoming a super badass at the very end of the story. Most of the story consists of long conversations. This book takes the danger and excitement out of the confrontation of David versus Goliath that is center of most environmental battles. The environmental battles of today, and even going back the past 30 years, 40, 50 years, it's about people who don't have power, that don't have organization, coming together to fight a large power motivated by greed, at least stereotypically, and trying to overcome that greedy power structure like a giant Goliath and to defeat it. And rarely is the big power defeated, but it's that fun underdog tale that is compelling. This takes that compelling part and replaces it with all the boring shit about activism, about environmental battles. There's long, tedious meetings. There's the long game of gaining control of public perception by writing newspaper articles. There's long conversations about characters and between characters that are not essential to the plot, but somehow are tangentially related to the overall organizing effort. And you just sit in a chair and you drink a glass of punch with them and talk for about 7 pages about stuff. And somehow maybe it comes back to the story, but maybe not. And this book is 454 pages for that reason. Very little of it is actually about action oriented toward resolving the major plot. I mean, so many long conversations. I'm reading this on Kindle. I just keep pressing forward, and it's still just dialogue and dialogue with old granny something or other who has lived in the neighborhood. And I'm wondering what tie she has to the story. And it's so minimal that it just feels like this had no editing. So I get that MacDonald is a good writer of dialogue, but dialogue ceases to impress when it kills the momentum of a story. And the novel's momentum, little that there ever is constantly stalled by these conversations, by indecision, by Jimmy Wing not really being clear on what he wants, and by the introduction of new and unnecessary characters. I read it because I had to, but I swear to God I would have kicked this book to the curb at page 200 if I had the option. I didn't. Fortunately, things got good in the latter half, but really, it wasn't until around 400 that things really started moving, maybe 350. Even when things happen, things don't really happen. It's just from nothing happening to something a little bit happening feels like a lot. There's my big positive thumbs up review for this book. Obviously, I'm not a fan. Also, the main character, Jimmy Wing, and we'll spend some time talking about this guy. He doesn't really do a good deed until the end. And now I don't expect my protagonist to be like, I don't need some kind of hero. I'm okay with anti-heroes. I'm okay with assholes as long as they're charming. But he is neither charming nor inspiring in any way, nor even assholish enough to warrant like the kind of dislike that almost turns into like. He just is bland and boring and depressed and sort of pointless. But then all of a sudden he wakes up at the end and does some cool stuff. But also there's a scene with Kat when he finally, quote unquote, gets the girl that, as far as I'm concerned, is rape.
Yeah, it is.
If I didn't like him at the beginning, he essentially rapes the only redeemable character in the story and makes me go, I don't give a fuck what he does at the end to save the day, if he does. I don't care about this guy. I never did. Now I don't like him at all. And it just boggles my mind. So if this were my first John D. MacDonald book, I would go, wow, this guy sucks. I hate him. And I wouldn't read his work. But I know that's not the case. I've read Travis McGee stuff. I know he crafted a very good tale. But this story in particular, the end of it did not redeem the long slog at the beginning. And for that reason, I first asked, where were the editors? This could have been a 200-page book. And that would have been maybe riveting. But also, as a crime book, I give this 2.5 out of 5 stars, meaning it's the worst review I've ever given a feature for our show. If I consider this a mainstream fiction novel, meaning just a novel that happens to have some crime in it, but mostly it's about these characters and these domestic, dramatic, daily life type things that happen in the story, all these conversations and really capturing the setting of Florida. I give it a 3.5 out of 5 for that because MacDonald is a good writer, the dialogue is good, and the setting, the feeling of Florida in a hot, sultry summer, the drinks and the color and the light and all that, it's really well captured. If I wanted to just sit around in Florida for a day, I could read this novel and I'd feel like it. Nothing would happen, but I'd feel like I'm in Florida. He does that well. I'm sorry to our listeners for making you sludge through this Everglades-sized slough of molasses, but that's what it was. It felt like I'm swimming through molasses to get through to the end. That sucks. But there are some interesting aspects of this book that are worth talking about. And I turn it over to you, Kurt, to respond to my extra long summary today. What'd you think? What did I miss?
I think you've I don't know, grabbed the gator by the tail pretty well there. Yeah, as I said in part one, this is not a thrilling book for me either. I think I have to agree with you. As a crime fiction tale, this is definitely a 2.5. I had that same gut feeling, and I wouldn't even give it a 3.5 as a other literary work. I might just bump it up to a 3. I think it's interesting as an artifact of MacDonald's work. I think it's interesting as an artifact of the genre. That said, a lot of things that have that kind of description are only interesting to read for people who are, I guess, scholars of a genre or extremely interested in a genre. So that's the first time we've had that experience on this show. And, again, we do apologize for that, listeners. But I do think there are some interesting elements to talk about here.
Totally.
And later in the episode, we're also going to take a look at, all right, what are some of the things we would do to this book to make it more of something that would get a 4 or 5 star review from Point Blank Podcast. So I'm not going to disagree with anything that you said in your review, but one thing that came to mind while you were talking is I think there's a few things that MacDonald does poorly in creating tension in this book right from the get-go, and that's that he never illustrates and he never gives, let's just call it the Save Our Bays Foundation, all of those characters, the people who are opposed to this development. He never really gives them any power in this story. He pretty much says that they won last time, and then they start the book here with having to rebuild to fight this new development. However, he never gives them any kind of win at any point, in the process. So you have a powerful character illustrated by Elmo Bliss, and then you have characters who have already lost all of their power in the story as the opposition, and then the story is just about how the powerful guy removes more and more power from an already underprivileged group.
Yeah, it's such a weird plot move. Like, what was MacDonald's thinking in making that move? There's no inertia.
No, there isn't. And it makes for extremely boring reading. And, as you said, I had written down you could have cut the first 350 pages out of this 450 page
It's so
novel.
terrible to say. It's terrible to say that much needs to be cut. But honestly, it's chopping room material. It truly is.
Yeah, it is. I don't believe that MacDonald is far enough along in his career here where an editor, where he would have the power to override the editor.
No.
I know he would do that later on with a sort of similar book, that condominium book.
Yeah, that was toward the twilight of his career.
Yes, yeah. And at that point, he was selling so many books under the Travis McGee label that anything else he wanted to publish, they pretty much had to say yes to keep the McGee contract.
Yeah.
But he's not there yet. So why didn't either an editor, either they assigned the wrong editor to this and they tried to market this as something that it is not, or, I don't know, maybe this was some sort of grasp to get away from the pulp noir audience and grab that more mainstream middle class, upper middle class audience. And it was a test of, exactly how much darkness could they handle here. And I know that's one thing that one of the reviewers or scholars of MacDonald's work mentioned in the biography is that was something that MacDonald did achieve, was to be able to be attractive to a wider range. And just because anytime I see a reference to Charles Williams, I'm going to bring it up. MacDonald thought that Charles Williams was one of the least recognized authors of the period. And this commentator who was talking about comparing the two of them, was saying, well, Williams was too dark for an average middle-class audience, whereas MacDonald was more accessible to that audience. Therefore, he would sell more books. And I can see that in this book because the tension, it's not gritty urban, it's not even gritty rural type.
No, this is suburban.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing that a suburbanite would be like, oh, wring their hands about. This is more about a reputation being ruined than although there is some assaults, there's definitely assaults in this book, but the majority of characters are more concerned about their reputation in the community.
Yeah, it's a sleepy town. It's middle class to upper middle class, suburban like town, and then therefore the audience is going to be that kind of audience. And this was put out by Simon & Schuster. This isn't Gold Medal. This isn't Farah. This isn't some crime imprint. This is mainstream, big time publication. And that's probably why he was so invested, or so he put this book on such a pedestal. It might have been a personal victory for him to transcend he wasn't just writing another dime novel. He finally had made it, so to speak.
Yeah, well, that, and I think he's writing a novel that's close to his personal experience of some of the community issues he was involved
That's
in.
true, because he was an environmentalist. I mean, it might have been early, but
Yeah.
I mean, this stuff meant a lot to him.
Yeah, it did, and he was involved in a similar struggle against a development, and I'm sure that he's like, well, here's my story in fiction, and maybe that's why it was so, like I said in the part one, this was considered by MacDonald one of his favorite novels, which that baffles me, but whatever, that's his choice. Yeah. As a reader, I can't see that, but whatever.
Sure. And like you said, it does mirror his real life. Him and his wife for quite a long time lived in Sarasota, and they lived on Siesta Key, which has beautiful beaches. I've been there. But at the time, it was, he had a house there. And I know that they had a battle because there were some developers coming in and threatening to build a complex close to their property. And, sort of a little bit of NIMBYism here, not in my backyard, type of like reactionary politics. But it suddenly brought out the environmentalist in him. He started to see perhaps that was the catalyst. Maybe he already had it in him, but he valued the ecosystem, and he wanted to make sure that things got preserved. He wanted to protect the beauty. There's a little bit of irony in that, because later on in his life, they actually bought out some of the wildlands close to their property and raised them to build a new house. So it shows, we're all hypocrites, and this is an example of that for him. It didn't help me with already not enjoying the novel very much to see that that happened as well. But, we're all human beings at the end. So
let's go back to those characters. As you mentioned, Jimmy Wing and Elmo Bliss and Kate Hubble. And there are a whole bunch of other characters, but frankly, most of them have almost no depth to them whatsoever. They're just... they're mentioned for a few pages here and there, and that's it. And that's really disappointing, because some of those characters could have carried a lot more narrative weight than Jimmy, for sure, and possibly Kate. Like she doesn't change much through the novel. In the opening pages, I actually thought that she was going to be our main protagonist for some reason.
Well, I mean, the story starts with her, so you'd think that, and then we leave her quite often.
And Jimmy, as you said, is just such a weak character. And I had to think back, because, he gets essentially bought out by he is bought out by Elmo Bliss. And it's not really made that clear in the book that he has more motivation than I think it's like $50 a week or something that Bliss is going to pay him. It's not a lot of money, but Bliss also holds his spot as a reporter over his head. But the more important thing, and again, this isn't that clear in the novel, is that Bliss has something to do with the care, the medical care that Jimmy's wife is receiving in the mental hospital.
Yes.
It's just not made clear, because he doesn't really say, like, if it's sort of insinuated that he's paying the bills, or he got her a spot there, and if Jimmy steps on his toes, he's going to kick her out of there or something. Yeah. The tension...
Well, the tension's a problem, because we never see, this is all off screen. Like Jimmy Wing as a happy, positive, loving human being who has things he wants in the world, like his wife and his past life. We don't see any of it. We don't see his relationship. We just hear sort of from him and through other characters that Jimmy's wife sort of went nuts, and she has a lot of issues, and she was in this institution, and we hear them talking about this person, but we never see it on screen, so we don't feel it. And Jimmy is such a passive, depressed character that we never see him in the before and after. We don't see him, his potential for the character we want him to be. We don't. So we have nothing to really root for. We just see him in the dumps, and we hear this threat doesn't hold much weight to the reader, because it doesn't appear to hold much weight to Jimmy, because he just seems sort of resigned.
Yeah, that resigned is a great word. I was about to say depressed, but resigned is even better, because he's just so stuck in a situation. There's no development. There's no drive either down the dark path or to get out of that path. It's just nothing happens with him, and it's frankly a very boring way to write a novel.
Nothing happens until page 400. That's a lot of pages where nothing happens to your character. The ups and downs aren't even real. There's not really ups and downs even. There's not even like the typical
No.
end of Act 1 sort of dramatic moment. There's no sort of building toward a climax. It's just sort of random interviews and conversations as you work toward this battle between the developers and the middle class environmentalists. And you know it's going to happen because the book has to end sometime, but you don't actually feel it happening. It literally feels like a real long ass meeting.
Yeah, it really does. And when Bliss first comes into the scene, as you call the Boss Hogg character, I was thinking, okay, now things are going to ramp up. We've got the stereotypical evil investor developer guy, and he's gonna put the screws on Jimmy and the Save Our Bays Foundation.
Yeah.
And Jimmy is brought into his care or under his wing to investigate these Save Our Bays people and basically push them out of a pretty much already lost fight. And each one of those events takes forever for anything to happen. And then they do push some people out, make them go on vacations, leave the town. Those things happen, but the way that those things happen is still
it's like,
boring.
who cares?
It's
Yeah, it's like, hey, this person we never met, and they might vote on this in favor of it, so let's send them on vacation. Okay, we did. So what? What does that leave the reader? They don't know that character. They don't. What's at stake is pretty small. I mean, it's big for environmental purposes, but you can say the bay is important, and I get that, and I understand that as somebody who supports environmental issues, But still, these characters, you got to make the characters have that drive so that we can feel like they're really losing something. You mentioned that Elmo sort of brought it. When we were introduced to Elmo Bliss, you were like, okay, now we got something. Now it's going to happen. Because I think he might be the best. He might be the best character because he comes ready to be the antagonist. He's ready. He's got the moral ambiguity. He's got the conniving. He's got the power. He's got the henchmen. He's got the guys who will give you a knuckle sandwich if you mess with them. So that's perfect. What doesn't happen is that Jimmy's not up to the challenge.
Yeah, and I think that as a modern reader, that's where it's really frustrating. You have all the elements of a ton of tension here. You have a journalist on the break, on the breaking point with everything going wrong in his life, and he has to make a major decision. You have a essentially evil developer guy who's trying to corrupt the town. You have a group of flawed but noble, essentially heroes trying to fight this development. You've even got a crazy religious cult with this Reverend Harkness Combs guy, and even that is like really. I mean, what they utilize it for is dark and disturbing, but it's not to the degree that it should be in a piece of fiction like
especially
this.
For something that Florida noir today, that would be the first place we go. We'd be in the midst of that little palmetto fortress with a bunch of yahoos and religious cult members. That's perfect fodder for a Dorsey novel. But here they're on the periphery until the very end, and they serve a function, but it's not central. It doesn't bring us into the weirdness, and that would have been okay in terms of things that would have made this novel better, I guess, just more exciting for the reader. Bring the weird on the fringe into the center, and don't make the center about a bunch of boring middle class people who are essentially like retired. That's how it felt a lot of times. Like I was in a retirement community having conversations. Get us in with the freaks and shake things up and make it happen. Or bring the freaks into the regular world and have them sort of mingle so that we get this tension. But the other thing, the most important thing, is make Jimmy the character that we all wanted him to be. Make him the idealist journalist, crusader, who is a muckraker and wants to, who's going to take on Elmo. And he doesn't have it in him. He's not strong enough to do it, but put him through the ringer. Get all the stuff that happens at the end of him. He gets into fights and trouble and all that. Have that happen to him at the beginning and have him sort of grind out and grit out this victory through hard or loss, but put him in there and let him be somebody we can root for. A flawed asshole, I don't care, but make him believe in something. He just doesn't have that belief in anything, it seems, except, I guess, raping Cat at the end, which is like the worst possible thing you can have your hero do.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, because it is it's problematic on a number of different levels. And one, it's not because it's in there. I mean, that's fine to have it, especially we are talking crime fiction. So, rape is potentially going to happen. But the way that it happens in this book is, well, first of all, Jimmy's desire is not portrayed it's not intensified enough to get to that point. I mean, he's still obviously very infatuated with her, but I think we should have seen more internal, especially since he's our protagonist, more internal psychosis or whatever of this desire that he can no longer like contain.
Yeah.
And then what I will give MacDonald credit for here is that he does write. Now, okay, if any of our readers or any of our listeners are confused and they've read this and they go, well, that's not a rape. No, what MacDonald has done here is he is actually done a fairly decent job of describing how, for a woman in this situation, it is rape, but she's not screaming rape at the same time, because it exactly says here that she basically, it would be easier for her to have sex with him than to say no or fight him off.
Yeah. Yeah, which is still rape. It's a war of attrition.
Yes.
And she says no twice. Yes. And that's one more than she needs to. So it is rape, and she rationalizes it at the end, like people who have Stockholm syndrome rationalize any type of atrocity that occurs to them.
Her exact quote is, "I don't recall being raped exactly." Now, if a woman has to say that to you, you are definitely guilty of raping her. Just to be clear. And it's again, it's crime fiction. So we could have this. That would be fine. But then what MacDonald does at the end is when Jimmy has been broken down and you're sort of like, okay, maybe this is going to have a true noir ending. Basically, he wraps it up at the end with this like happy ending where Jimmy gets his job back and he's able to fight Elmo back at the paper, and then him and Kat go back to having coffee every morning and hanging out like buddies.
Yes. The act should have been a pivotal, like if you're going to have something like that happen in your story. And of course, nowadays you would expect that would be expected. Maybe because it was 1962,
yes.
Different rules, different playing field, different ways that we treated domestic relationships, everything like that. But you would expect that to be a pivotal turn in the way that the character develops, and there would be consequences for that action. We learn that Jimmy, while maybe depressed and ambivalent and not motivated, we were expecting him to be the hero. We realize that he's the villain, he's the bad guy, and nothing good befalls him. But it turns out things work out, and the rape's never talked about again. It's like it's not a big deal. It's just like, oh, that's just a thing that happens because he couldn't control his passion.
Yeah, and I think it's very flawed in this novel. However, I will say that if we look at the scope of MacDonald's overall fiction, multiple commentators have said that for a writer of his time, he wrote female characters rather well, and that he was actually considered to be something of a feminist writer for the time, which whatever. I don't know. I don't have enough.
I've read some, I'm going to say with the Travis McGee that does come through. I mean, Travis McGee is a sort of like smooth operator. He lives on a ship. There's always like the girl per novel type of scenario. But it isn't just a bunch of two-dimensional characters that come in to be a sex interest. He actually from his perspective, he struggles with his relationships with women, and he thinks it through, and he has a kind of some moral scruples about how he interacts. Like there's a thought process that goes in, and the characters, the women who come in, at least in the stories I've read, are developed characters and nuanced. And so I could see that being the case, which makes this seem to like maybe it's just a weird blip in his records, or maybe I just it's perplexing to me.
He did write those novels after that.
That's true
too. So he may have just developed as a human being.
That's true.
As well.
It's certainly. I'm not going to excuse it. Some might. I'm not going to excuse it. I don't think this is acceptable in any protagonist, unless their protagonist is a sort of a really developed to be the kind of protagonist where this makes sense. But because we never really get to know who Jimmy is, this doesn't help his case, and that's where I'll leave it. I'm satisfied with that. It definitely didn't make me like the book more in the third act after that scene.
I think we have talked extensively about how we would improve this novel. We would make it much tighter. We would probably start the action way farther in. we would give both Jimmy's path and Jimmy, Elmo, and Kate's path more, make their paths fall harder or be more corrupt or just intensify all of those.
Yeah,
elements.
I want their clashes should be a little bit more heightened, and we don't really get that clash.
He should have given the Save Our Bays group a little bit more power overall, because in the whole realm of this, you kind of get the impression it's like a dozen people, and that's it. And they've already essentially, they're starting from a position of defeat, and they're just being defeated even further as the novel goes on. Giving them at least some kind of a win in the early stages would have created more tension between these two groups.
Yeah, it's like watching the end of a huge like war battle where the good guys have already had their last big stand, and now you know that reinforcements are coming for the bad guys, and they're moving on in. Sort of like Empire Strikes Back, but without any of the art or the drama. Just like, oh, now the Empire is going to retaliate, and they do, and you lose, and the whole story is that without anything else, anything to boost your spirit or make you understand anybody better. So yeah, it's just like an odd duck. And there are good things though, and I would love to talk a bit briefly about writer's craft, like what stood out to you. I have a couple of things that I like about this novel.
Yeah. I do think you see MacDonald capturing Florida very well.
Yes, definitely.
It does invoke place extremely well. It invokes the right, and when I say environment here, I mean not just the natural environment he's talking about, but the urban environment, the whole thing. He does capture that the changing, I guess, civilization is one way you could put it. That is something that comes up in his McGee novels later on in maybe a more fully formed thing, and it's said that McGee is a mouthpiece for MacDonald's diatribe against the spoiling of the environment and the corrupting of civilization, and that comes from the Red Hot Typewriter. But that's a theme here that we are seeing in A Flash of Green, but something he would definitely develop further in the McGee novels. And I think that's something that you see not in all Florida crime fiction, but at least in some elements of Florida crime fiction. That is definitely a thematic element that other writers have latched onto. So I think you do see a lot of bits of this that other writers say, oh, there's a little nugget here. And if I just take that and do essentially what we were talking about, magnify it, I'll have a much more interesting
Definitely.
narrative.
I agree that Florida is center stage in this book, and place as character. Florida is definitely a character in this book. Everything about Florida fuels the plot, fuels the characters' desires and interactions. I mean, this is not a hard-boiled book, and you could assume that with the 454 pages, but the writing style is florid. This is mainstream fiction writing. It's full, it's detailed, it's developed. Writers talk, or characters talk and talk and talk. It isn't terse dialogue. But place matters in this book. I wrote that I got sweaty reading it. I can almost smell the salty Gulf breeze and hear the mosquitoes buzzing in my ear. The way that he describes Grassy Bay and the surroundings. On page 5, for example, as he starts to talk about Florida itself and give context, this is the kind of writing that he provides. The lower Gulf course from Tampa to the Keys was enfolded in an airless July heat, which was so merciless it had little flavor of tropic languor. Instead, it seemed to have a humming intensity, an expectancy, as though any moment the Gulf and the bays would be brought to a boiling point, and all the roofs would break into flame. Each afternoon, the thunderheads made their lazy, ominous atomic symbols out over the Gulf. This is lyrical. This is heavily descriptive, and it really centers the story on the location, which wasn't the case for Queenpin. Remember, we didn't know if Queenpin took place in Las Vegas or Atlantic City or the moon, because place didn't matter so much as characters' interactions. But not so in this book. And I give him credit for that. Some of the descriptive lyrical writing was captivating. And if this was a 200-page book filled with rich description, plus some more hard-boiled, action-oriented, shenanigans, I would have. That's the book I would have wanted to read.
I think we see that much more in the McGee novels.
Definitely.
That's something we're going to have to visit in the future. But that sense of place and the issues that are important to Florida is something that will probably always be important to Florida crime fiction and is something that authors are still working with today. So if there's a real legacy of MacDonald, it's modernizing that crime fiction again and bringing Florida to the forefront of the crime fiction
Yeah,
genre.
he put Florida on the map as one of these places like San Francisco and Los Angeles, New York, other big places where crime fiction happens. Let's call him the godfather of Florida noir. This isn't a best representative of it, but there are many more, and I'm sure we will return to him down the road and focus on maybe one of the McGee stories, one of the better ones, so we can give him a fair read and not just poo-poo his work, because I know he's better than this book. And I know some readers out there probably will disagree with us, and they might find this book to be great. And we'd love to hear your comments on it on the GoodReads site or on our Facebook group site, because we don't mean to rag on this book. We're not doing it for likes or just to be diabolical or devil's advocate. This just truly is a book that neither of us really got on board with. So if you have an alternative way of seeing it, we'd love to have you share that with us.
Real Stupid Mysteries.
All right, we haven't had a real stupid mystery in a while, at least I haven't, but I've been so influenced by Florida noir and these protagonists who have an interest in the environment that I wanted to take it back old school all the way to the 19th century. And I bring to you this new batch of great fiction, which is yours to run away with. It's called the Thoreau and Emerson Mysteries. By day, Henry Thoreau lives alone in a cabin outside Concord, Massachusetts, on land owned by his friend and mentor, Ralph Emerson. But by night, he still lives alone in a cabin in a forest. In fact, he spends so much time writing about the fallibility and stupidity of the human race that he doesn't have much time to investigate the malfeasance of his neighbors. That is, until that one afternoon, while hunting after the woodchucks who have torn up his bean garden, he hears a feminine cry for help, and off he goes in search of the fair maiden in distress. It turns out to be a train whistle. But later that night, there is a rap at the door of his cabin. He considers not opening it, but he realizes that the lamp is lit. At the door stands his friend and mentor, Ralph Emerson. Emerson exclaims, "Nathaniel Hawthorne has been beheaded!" Thus begins a series of mystery tales so intoxicatingly dull and full of tangents that they rival none of the crime writers you love. Such titles in this series include What is the Purpose of My Steadfastness? The Economics of Small Gardens, Why I Will Not Pay the Poll Tax, and most notably, Who Stole Emerson's Goat? Along with the sequel, Who Stole Thoreau's Bean Rake? So, there you go. Run with it, folks.
Oh, that's great, Justin. That really made me laugh. I don't know what about that pair.
I would love to see at least one of these books at least churned out into a story.
Yeah. No, I think you found the perfect crime fighting duo that nobody has ever considered before.
Oh boy. So we actually have some real books to consider for 5-round bursts, so we should dive into that before we wrap up this episode.
It's time once again for 5-round burst. 5-round burst is when we do roughly 5 reviews in roughly 5 minutes. And today I've actually got 5 books of my own. I'm gonna do a single review and 2 double shots today, Justin.
So I'll do mine, and then Kurt will just riff on the 1,000 of books he read this month. Mine is James W. Hall's Silencer. This is book 11 in the Thorn series, and I read this because I was reading MacDonald and excited about MacDonald and his legacy. And James W. Hall's Thorn character is modeled off of Travis McGee, at least in part, and was heavily influenced by MacDonald's canon. So here's the deal. Thorn is a solitary Florida man living a quiet life in the Keys like a misanthropic Jimmy Buffett. He makes flies to catch the local bonefish and occasionally joins his ex-cop buddy Sugarman in crime-solving shenanigans in South Florida. So this is the 11th novel, and I typically don't start a series in the 11th book, and this is true in this case. I've read some of the others, but for the sake of this review, 11th novel, start somewhere else, but I'm going to review this one. In this one, Thorn is different than his other books. He's more mellow. He's mellowed out. He has a girlfriend who's convinced him to throw a party to celebrate his birthday or something. It's not something that is a typical Thorn behavior, but he acquiesces. Well into the night of the party, a couple tough guys sneak into the house when everybody's good and drunk, and they catch Thorn in the kitchen alone, and he doesn't have the wherewithal, several sheets to the wind, to defend himself. They kidnap him, they pull a gun on him, and take him away. The question is why? The story connects the dots between Thorn, an old Florida ranch that Thorn was planning to purchase and preserve with some money he accrued through some plot from a previous novel, and a secret fortune buried in the ranch's sandy soil. This book was what I expected A Flash of Green to be, which sucks to say, but it's true. I expected there to be more propulsive narrative, and in this book there certainly is that. I mean, part of it is a little bit paint by numbers, commercial crime novel. This is the 11th in a series, and I could tell where the plotting is pretty much, created. But James Hall is a strong writer. He was a professor at FIU and a PhD, and the themes of greed and environmental preservation, the kind of themes that we saw in A Flash of Green, make this book topical and give it a special resonance. Thorn doesn't get to do too much in this book, and when he does, he's a bit of a Mary Sue. He's sort of a captive for a lot of it, and then all of a sudden, he's not a captive, so watch out, right? Still, I like and recommend the Thorn series as a whole. I wouldn't start with 11, but this is certainly a hit. I enjoyed reading this book.
My first book for this episode is October Heat. This was written in 1979 by Gordon Demarco, originally published by Germinal Press. What this is an interesting take on the San Francisco detective novel. From the detective point of view and a plotting point of view, you're not going to find anything new here. But why I was drawn to this is that it brings in elements of San Francisco's labor history and sort of San Francisco historic leftyism. And it takes place during just prior to the 1934 election for governor. And what we have here is a plot of basically a fascist takeover of the governorship of California. Our detective is brought in to solve basically a domestic dispute, and this just spirals into a larger and larger conspiracy that ultimately incorporates California fascists. It brings in the International Longshoremen's Association, labor organizers, Charlie Chaplin, and a lot of historic figures who were involved in this struggle in the 30s in California between elements of the left and the right. And I thought the author did a pretty good job of bringing in historic characters and then also fictionalizing some other characters. It's interesting if you find that history interesting. Otherwise, as a detective novel, you're not going to find anything necessarily new here. So this is a, well, let's use red herring of a book. Yes. If you're interested, yes, in that, you would enjoy this. And I have to say, what I found this book is I was looking at, I believe Crime Reads website had a Labor Day type list of books, crime books with labor history in them, and this one popped up. We had just been to San Francisco, so I picked this up. This is hard to find, but for some people, if any of that sounds interesting to you, this is going to be interesting. If it doesn't sound interesting, then just avoid the book. Next up, I have a double shot, and what I'm calling a double shot is two reviews from the same author. So first up, I have two books from Frank Bill. I have Crimes in Southern Indiana and Donnybrook. Crimes was written in 2011, and Donnybrook was written in 2013. Both of these are from Farr, Strauss, and Gouraud. Bill's writing is the type of writing that probably can and should only be attempted by someone who is intimately familiar with a place. And we talked about MacDonald and the intimacy of Florida in his writing. Well, Bill is doing that to Southern Indiana. He brings in a lot of elements of that sort of working class, hillbilly-esque clash of immigrants and rural life. And if you don't think that the American rural landscape is strife or ripe, rather, for crime fiction, you need to read Frank Bill. I really think Crimes of Southern Indiana is the stronger book, perhaps because Bill is a little bit better at writing short stories, where Donnybrook is a full novel. In Crimes, the characters are intertwined, but each story does stand alone. Donnybrook follows up on some of those characters and is essentially a companion novel. But especially Crimes in Southern Indiana, is a full force, like bottle of moonshine to the head. It is good. I enjoyed it. His language is excellent. It just captures the place well. It's good. Read Crimes in Southern Indiana. Donnybrook, as I said, not as strong, but still recommended. It's about a big fight at a farm and sort of the build-up and crimes involved with stealing the prize money of this bare-knuckle boxing match. And that one is still a pretty meaty fist to the face as well. So 2 hits from Frank Bill. And then next up, I've got 2 from the late, great Anthony Bourdain. Yes, for those who are not aware, prior to Kitchen Confidential, prior to all of the travel shows, Bourdain, not only was he a chef, but he was a crime novelist. He wrote 3 crime books: Bone in the Throat, Gone Bamboo, and the Bobby Gold stories. And I haven't gotten a copy of Bone in the Throat to reread, but I was able to get a hold of Gone Bamboo and the Bobby Gold stories, and both of these are really good. It's interesting to think if Bourdain had found more notoriety as a crime fiction author, or if he had stuck with crime writing, because he's very good at it. These are not a celebrity writes a book kind of things. These are solid crime fiction pieces. First up, Gone Bamboo was originally written in 1997 from Bloomsbury. Takes place in St. Martin, and it follows hitman Henry and his wife Frances as a hit goes wrong early in the book, and the target of that hit ends up in witness protection and sent to the same island that the hitman and his wife currently live on, and hijinks ensue. This is in the realm of that sort of crazy wise-ass comedy fiction. A lot of his books involve New York gangsters, as you might imagine, kitchen workers, as you also might imagine, but he blends the elements well, and he really does a nice job with them. They're fun reads. I think the Bobby Gold is slightly the stronger book here. That one follows a mob enforcer guy whose mob boss is kind of losing his power in the mob, and he kind of has to go off on his own. So Bobby Gold, he falls in love with a line cook named Nicole, and they have to sort of double cross their mob boss Eddie Fish and go on the run. These are nice, especially that one. It's like 120 pages. It's a nice tight crime novel. Definitely Bourdain should be remembered as a crime novelist, as well as all of the other things that he did in his life. So those are 2 knives across the throat from Bourdain, and if you've never read them, I would encourage you to give them a chance.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. Rest in peace, Bourdain. I'm glad to hear that his crime fiction, at least in your perspective, holds up.
Well, thank you once again, everyone, for joining us for Point Blank. Our next episode is going to be
Walter Mosley's Devil in the Blue Dress, the first in the Mosley's series featuring his main character, whose name I don't remember.
And followed by Dorothy
Hughes, in a lonely place. This is some old school noir. It's been recommended by a friend of mine, and I've been excited about reading this. It's been on my shelf for about a year now, so we're going to dig into that for episode 17. And for those of y'all who are eager to read ahead, 18 is a weird little number that brings us way back to Horace McCoy of Black Mask fame. A book he wrote called They Shoot Horses, Don't They? It's a short little piece, but it was claimed by several prominent writers, including, I believe, Albert Camus, to be to being one of the first existential novels. And it's a pretty weird one. It's a
Wow.
cool, weird read, unlike anything we've read yet. So it's also another short one. So
Cool.
looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, me too. Well, if you want to get in touch with the show, you can find us on Facebook at Point Blank Noir, Hard-Boiled, and Detective Fiction. You can send us an email at pointblanknoir@gmail.com or send us a tweet at pointblanknoir. We also have a new and exciting GoodReads group that you should be able to find with a little search of Point Blank. It was set up by one of our listeners, Jeff. And we're doing a very nice discussion there of our main topic books and some of our 5 round burst recommendations. It's a good forum where you can actually see some discussion developing. And we will be utilizing some of those comments in the future. Before we record the podcast, we'll take a look at some of our listener comments and try to incorporate that into the show. So if you want to be part of the discussion, check out that GoodReads group.
Sounds good. And of course, always spread the word. If you like us, let your friends know, and also give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you can review us. We do like the support, and it helps to make us feel good about ourselves and keep us going.
Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
See ya.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.